There is a city that does not belong to any single people. It does not belong to one faith, one flag, one era. And yet, somehow, it belongs to everyone who has ever looked up at a dark sky and asked a question they could not answer. Everyone who has ever needed to believe that suffering is not the last word, that something endures. This is Jerusalem. A city that has been destroyed twice and rebuilt from its own ashes, besieged 23 times, attacked 52 times, conquered and reconquered 44 times, and still, after more than 5,000 years of recorded memory, it stands, not merely as a collection of streets and walls and market stalls and minarets, but as the spiritual axis of more than 3 billion human beings alive on Earth today. That is not history. That is something closer to a miracle. Or tucked into the limestone hills of the southern Levant, Jerusalem rises at 830 meters above the sea. It is not on a great river. It has no natural harbor. It controls no vital spice route. By the cold logic of geography, the same logic that explains why cities rise where rivers meet the sea, why empires grow from fertile plains, Jerusalem should not matter. A small, rocky, semi-arid hilltop in the ancient Near East. Difficult to reach, short of water, far from the great corridors of trade. And yet no other city in human history has been fought over more fiercely, wept over more deeply, sung about more beautifully, or prayed toward more persistently. Why here? Why this hill? Why this stone? Because on this hill, fathers nearly killed their sons. Empires burned temples to ash, armies slaughtered in the name of God, and people still return. That is the question this film asks, and the answer, like the city itself, was layered, century beneath century, faith beneath faith, civilization beneath civilization, each layer pressing down on the one before it, each one insisting it is the foundation, the origin, the truth. The old city of Jerusalem today measures less than 1 square kilometer. You can walk its perimeter in less than an hour. You can cross it end to end in 30 minutes. It is smaller than many university campuses, smaller than many shopping centers. And yet within those ancient walls, walls rebuilt by an Ottoman sultan in the 16th century over foundations that have been laid and relaid for 3,000 years, exist 4 distinct quarters: Jewish, Christian, Muslim, Armenian, each preserving its own rituals, its own silences, its own version of what this ground means and who it belongs to. These are not simply neighborhoods. They are entire worlds, entire civilizations, pressed together by centuries of shared history and irreconcilable memory, separated not by distance, but by the weight of everything that has happened here. To walk through Jerusalem is to walk through time itself. Every stone has a story. Every arch frames a different century. Every worn step carries the echo of 1,000,000 footfalls, pilgrims, merchants, soldiers, priests, refugees, kings. Every market stall stands where some ancient temple, mosque, church, or palace once breathed. Listen. The call to prayer rising from the minarets of the Muslim quarter, long and haunting. the peal of church bells from the Christian quarter, answering from a different rooftop, the sound of Torah study drifting from behind a courtyard wall, steady and ancient. 3 voices, 3 traditions, 3 living faiths, all occupying the same air above the same ancient stone at the same moment, as they have done for centuries. Jerusalem is not a museum. It is alive, and it has always been alive, always been contested, because what is at stake here has never been merely land. You can negotiate over land, you can draw lines across land, you can divide it, sell it, legislate it. But what is at stake in Jerusalem is meaning itself. And meaning cannot be divided. The story of Jerusalem is the story of human longing. It is the story of what happens when the deepest need of the human heart, the need to believe that this life is not all there is, or that we are known by something greater than ourselves, becomes attached to a physical place, a specific hill, a specific stone, and then other people from other traditions, with other prophets and other prayers, discover that the same stone is sacred to them as well. What do you do then? What has anyone ever done? That question has driven more wars than any geographer would expect from a city this small. And it has produced more beauty, more architecture, more poetry, more music, more art than any city 10 times its size. This is Jerusalem. Let us begin. At the heart of the old city, elevated above everything around it, lies a vast open plateau of golden stone. Muslims call it Haram al-Sharif, the noble sanctuary. Jews call it Har Habayit, the Temple Mount. Christians, too, hold it sacred, for Jesus walked here and spoke of its destruction with tears in his eyes. No single piece of ground in the world has been the center of more longing, more prayer, more conflict, and more theology than this elevated stone platform of 37 acres. It is not the largest sacred site on earth. It is not the oldest, but it is the most contested and perhaps the most layered, a place where the fingerprints of 3 civilizations overlap so completely that no single one of them can be removed without pulling the others apart. The story begins before Jerusalem was Jerusalem, long before kings or conquests, before names had been given to this hill at all. According to Jewish tradition, this is Mount Moriah, the very mountain where God tested Abraham, where the father of a faith raised a knife above his only son, ready to offer everything he loved at the command of a God he could not see. And where, at the last moment, God intervened, providing a ram caught in a thicket as a single act of absolute faith, and this hill became sacred forever, the place where heaven and earth had touched. The story of that moment ripples forward across 4,000 years without ever fully settling. Abraham is the patriarch of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. All 3 faiths trace their spiritual lineage to him. All 3 understand that moment on the mountain as foundational. And all 3 have, at different moments in history, claimed the mountain itself. For centuries passed after Abraham, the tribe of Israel wandered through Egypt, through the wilderness, through 40 years of desert wandering under Moses, who led them out of slavery, but never entered the promised land himself, dying within sight of it on the other side of the Jordan River. It was his successor, Joshua, who brought them across. And it was King David, the shepherd boy turned king, the warrior poet who wrote the Psalms, who looked at a rocky hilltop held by a people called the Jebusites and understood its significance. David conquered the city. He renamed it. He brought the Ark of the Covenant here. The gold-covered acacia wood chest said to contain the 2 stone tablets on which God had written the 10 Commandments delivered to Moses on Mount Sinai. He established Jerusalem as the eternal capital of his kingdom, and he wanted to build a house for God on the same hill where Abraham had stood. He was not permitted to. The scriptures say it was because he was a man of war, and a house of God should be built by a man of peace. That task fell to his son, Solomon, and what Solomon built became one of the ancient world's most celebrated structures. The first temple. Ancient texts describe it in breathtaking detail. Its cedar wood interior, the timber imported all the way from Lebanon at enormous cost, its walls and floors and ceiling overlaid with gold, its great bronze pillars standing at the entrance, its inner sanctuary called the Holy of Holies, the most sacred room in the world, housing the Ark itself. The presence of God was believed to dwell there, between the wings of 2 golden cherubim, in a darkness so absolute and so sacred that only the high priest could enter, and only once a year, on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. He would enter alone, make the necessary offerings, and speak aloud the name of God, a name so holy it was otherwise never spoken. And then he would walk back out, and all of Israel would breathe again. For 4 centuries, it felt untouchable, eternal. Then, in the year 586 before the Common Era, Babylon arrived, and eternity burned. The Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar arrived with his armies. Jerusalem fell after a siege. The city burned. The temple burned. And the Ark of the Covenant, the most sacred object in the Jewish world, the physical dwelling of the divine presence, vanished, swallowed by history, never found. Or perhaps the most enduring mystery in all of human civilization, one that has captivated archaeologists, theologians, treasure hunters, and storytellers for 2,500 years without resolution. The Jewish people were taken into exile, marched hundreds of miles east to Babylon, where they sat beside rivers in a foreign land and wept. The Book of Psalms records it with a grief so raw it still catches the throat. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down and we wept. But when we remembered Zion, we hung up our harps on the willows. How shall we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? They sang it anyway, and they remembered, and they returned. 50 years after the exile, the Persian king Cyrus defeated Babylon and gave the Jewish people permission to go home. The Second Temple rose on the same hill, rebuilt by the returning exiles. Smaller at first, and then, centuries later, expanded by King Herod the Great into one of the most magnificent structures the ancient world had ever seen. Herod was a complicated man, a client king of Rome, despised by many of his own people, hungry for the legitimacy that great architecture could confer. He doubled the size of the Temple Mount by extending the hilltop artificially, filling in the valleys around it with stone and earth, creating a vast platform of 37 acres supported by enormous retaining walls built from limestone blocks weighing up to 500 tons each, some of them 11 meters long, moved without machinery, fitted without mortar. Standing still today, 2,000 years later, with a precision that continues to astonish engineers. The second temple that rose on this platform was a wonder of the ancient world. Its golden roof caught the morning sun so brilliantly that pilgrims approaching Jerusalem from the east would shield their eyes. Its courtyards could hold hundreds of thousands of worshippers. Jewish pilgrims came from across the known world 3 times a year for the great festivals, Passover, Shavuot, Sukkot, filling Jerusalem to overflowing, or her city alive with prayer and sacrifice and the smell of cedar smoke and incense drifting over the limestone hills. Into this city, in a year that divided the calendar of the Western world, a man from the small northern town of Nazareth walked through the temple gates and looked at what he saw with eyes that shone with grief. But we will return to that story in a moment. First, the fall. In the year 70 of the Common Era, after 4 years of Jewish revolt against Roman rule, the Roman general Titus breached Jerusalem's walls after a siege of 5 months. The city was burning. The temple fell. The Jewish historian Flavius Josephus, who had himself been a commander in the revolt before switching sides, witnessed what happened. He wrote that the fire was so intense that the gold melted and ran between the stones, and Roman soldiers pried the blocks apart, searching for it. And in doing so, they fulfilled, perhaps inadvertently, the prophecy attributed to Jesus, they spoken 40 years earlier as he walked away from the temple for the last time. There will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down. More than 1 million people died in the siege and its aftermath. Nearly 100,000 were taken as slaves. The menorah, the great 7-branched candelabrum of the temple, was carried through the streets of Rome in triumph, its image carved on the arch of Titus, where it can still be seen today. It was not only a military defeat, it was a theological earthquake. If God lived here and the house was gone, where was God now? What remained of the temple? One section of the great retaining wall that Herod had built. Not the temple itself. That was gone, every stone thrown down, exactly as had been foretold. But the wall that held up the platform on which the temple had stood. The wall that was, in a sense, the temple's foundation. The Western Wall, and to this fragment, this surviving edge of a vanished world, Jewish people have returned for 2,000 years. People come to the Western Wall at all hours, at dawn when the light is pale gold, at midnight when the plaza is quiet and the stones seem to breathe, in winter rain and in the scorching heat of a Jerusalem summer. They press their palms against the cool stone. They close their eyes. They whisper things they have never said aloud to another human being, things they are ashamed of, things they are grateful for, names of people they love who are dying, names of people they have lost. They tuck small folded pieces of paper into the crevices between the ancient stones, prayers, pleas, confessions, names, a tradition so old no one can quite say when it began. Some are elaborate, written in multiple languages. Some are a single word. When the wall fills, the caretakers remove each piece gently and bury it in sacred ground. Not discarded, buried, because even the smallest fragment placed here is treated as something holy, a letter written to heaven. This is the Wailing Wall, and it is called that because of the weeping, the centuries of weeping for what was lost. But if you stand here long enough, you realize the name is incomplete. People are not only weeping, they are also praying. They are also arguing with God, as the Jewish tradition has always permitted. They are also giving thanks. The wall holds every emotion the human heart is capable of. It has been holding them for 2,000 years. Above the western wall, on the platform Herod built, something else now stands. Something that has stood there for more than 1,300 years. Something so beautiful that even those who did not build it, who do not pray in its direction, who belong to a different faith entirely, find themselves stopping and simply looking. In the year 691 of the Common Era, while the Umayyad Caliph Abd al-Malik completed construction of the Dome of the Rock, one of the oldest surviving works of Islamic architecture in the world, and one of the most breathtaking structures ever raised by human hands. Its golden dome, repaired and re-gilded many times over the centuries, most recently in the 1990s, when Jordan's King Hussein donated the gold from his own fortune, rests above the exposed natural bedrock of Mount Moriah itself. That rock, the very rock, is what the structure was built to honor. Because in Islamic tradition, this is the spot from which the Prophet Muhammad, on the night of the Isra and Miraj, the night journey, was carried by the angel Gabriel into the heavens on a winged creature called Burak, traveling first to Jerusalem from Mecca in an instant, then ascending through the 7 levels of heaven to stand before God. It was a journey of revelation, of prayer, of encounter with the divine, and it began here, from this rock, on this hill, the same rock where Abraham is said to have stood, the same hill where Solomon built his temple and where it burned. Now crowned with gold, its walls covered in turquoise and blue geometric tilework, inscribed with Quranic verses, facing Mecca. 3 great faiths, 1 stone, 3 encounters with the divine, all pointing to the same place on earth, all insisting on its sanctity, for reasons that overlap without ever quite aligning. And geography and theology have never been more perfectly, more uncomfortably, more magnificently fused. Let us walk now through different streets. Let us follow the narrowest, most worn path in the old city, the Via Dolorosa, the Way of Sorrows. 14 stations carved through the oldest layers of the city, tracing the final journey of Jesus Christ from the place of his condemnation to the place of his death. These streets are alive with the ordinary chaos of a city. Vendors call out prices. Metal rolling doors rise and fall. The scent of cardamom and fresh bread and incense and diesel mingles in the narrow air. Tourists with cameras brush past women carrying groceries on their heads. And through all of it, through the noise and the commerce and the 21st century pressing in from every direction, pilgrims move slowly. Some carrying wooden crosses on their shoulders, pausing at each station in silence, an act of devotion so old and so persistent that it has, quite literally, worn grooves into the stone beneath their feet. Christianity's connection to Jerusalem is inseparable from a single week, what believers call Holy Week, a Passover meal shared in an upper room with 12 followers, a night of prayer in a garden on the slope of a hill east of the city, a betrayal by one of those 12 for 30 pieces of silver, an arrest in the darkness, a trial before the Roman governor Pontius Pilate, who, according to the Gospels, washed his hands of the verdict, a crown of thorns, a cross carried through these very streets, through this noise, past these market stalls, beneath these arches that were already ancient when the events they frame occurred. And then, on a hill just outside the city walls, a hill the locals called Golgotha, the place of the skull, a crucifixion. And then, 3 days later, according to the faith that grew from this moment, an empty tomb, a folded burial cloth, a resurrection, the foundation of a belief that would, within 3 centuries, without armies, without political power, through nothing but the testimony of ordinary people willing to die for what they had witnessed, spread to every corner of the known world, all of it anchored here, in this city, on this hill. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre stands on the site traditionally identified as Golgotha and the tomb of Jesus. It does not look the way you imagine. There is no soaring, unified facade, no single grand vision of a single architect. It is low, uneven, almost apologetic from the outside, built in sections over 17 centuries by different hands in different eras, each generation preserving what the one before could not bear to remove, but each one adding its own layer of devotion without quite knowing what to do with what was already there. Roman foundations support Byzantine domes. Crusader stonework intersects with Ethiopian chapels perched on the roof. Coptic monks maintain a tiny shrine pressed against the outer wall like a child clinging to a parent. Inside, the aisles narrow abruptly, where builders ran out of space. Altars appear wherever walls permit, or steps descend to crypts that no single faith agrees upon the significance of. Light comes not from grand windows, but from hundreds of hanging oil lamps and small, high openings, leaving much of the interior in a warm, perpetual shadow that feels less like darkness and more like a kind of reverence made visible. It is less a building than a living argument. And within its walls, compressed into a space that is at once vast and intimate, are the sites associated with the crucifixion, the burial, and the resurrection of Christ, 3 of the most consequential moments in the history of a faith that shaped the civilization of half the world. 6 Christian denominations share authority here: Roman Catholic, Greek Orthodox, Armenian Apostolic, Coptic, Ethiopian, and Syriac Orthodox. The division of space and time within the Church is precise, almost surgical, the result of centuries of negotiation and occasional violent dispute, measured not in rooms or floors, but in steps, ledges, and time slots. Which denomination may pray at which altar, at what hour? Who may clean which section of floor? Who controls which lamp? In a city fought over by armies, even cleaning a floor can become an act of negotiation. A ladder sits beneath a window on the exterior facade. It was placed there more than 200 years ago. It has not moved since. Not because everyone forgot it was there, but because no denomination will permit any other to touch something in their section of wall, and the ladder sits precisely in disputed territory. It has become, in its immobility, a monument to the complexity of sharing sacred space. Art historians call it the immovable ladder. It is one of the most famous pieces of furniture in the world. And then there is this, the keys to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the holiest site in all of Christendom, the place where the central event of Christian faith is said to have occurred, are held not by any Christian denomination. They are held by a Muslim family. The Judaism family has kept the keys since the time of Saladin in the 12th century. Each morning, a member of the Nusibeh family, who hold the hereditary right to open and close the church, knocks on the Judaism door, Art collects the ancient iron key, walks to the church, and opens it. Each evening, the ritual reverses. The key goes back to the Judaism. The church is locked by the Nusibehs, and has been for 800 years. It began as a practical arrangement born of medieval necessity. An external keeper, belonging to neither of the competing Christian factions, could provide stability where shared Christian authority could not. But it has endured through 8 centuries of extraordinary upheaval, wars, plagues, earthquakes, empires falling and rising. And in its endurance, it says something that no theologian or diplomat has quite managed to put into words. That in Jerusalem, contradictions do not merely coexist, they hold the keys. Step out of the church, walk east, cross the Kidron Valley, and at the foot of the Mount of Olives, you will find a garden. The Garden of Gethsemane, enclosed by a low stone wall, shaded by 8 ancient olive trees, whose trunks are so twisted and hollowed by age that they look less like trees than like sculpture. Forms pulled into anguish by forces of time we cannot fully comprehend. These trees are estimated to be over 2,000 years old, while some researchers believe they may be the very descendants, rooted in the same earth, of the trees that stood here when the night that changed everything happened. According to the Gospels, it was here that Jesus came after the Last Supper with his disciples. He told them, "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death." He asked them to stay awake with him. They fell asleep. He prayed alone among the olive trees, and the Gospel of Luke says the sweat fell from him like drops of blood. He was in agony. He knew what was coming, and he chose not to run. Then the torches appeared through the trees. Judas walked at the head of the crowd. He greeted Jesus with a kiss, the signal by which the guards would know which man to take. Jesus said, "Do you betray the Son of Man with a kiss?" And then he was led away. The garden is small enough to cross in a few minutes. You could visit it in passing. I'd barely slow down and be gone. And yet, it holds one of the most quietly devastating moments in any human story ever told. A night shaped by anticipation, grief, loneliness, and a courage that does not look like courage. Because courage that does not feel like fear is just confidence. What happened in this garden was something harder. A man who knew exactly what was waiting for him and chose to stay. The olive trees are still alive, still bearing fruit, the same gnarled roots in the same ancient ground. To understand Jerusalem is to understand that it has almost never been at peace. Not truly. Not for long. The city's spiritual gravity, the force that draws 3 faiths and their billions of adherents to this single hill is precisely what has made it a prize worth fighting for across 5,000 years of human conflict. After the Roman destruction of the year 70 of the Common Era, Jerusalem ceased to exist in any recognizable form. The Emperor Hadrian, suppressing a second Jewish revolt in the year 135, razed what remained of the city and built a new Roman city on its ruins. He called it Aelia Capitolina. He built a temple to Jupiter on the Temple Mount. He banned Jews from entering the city under penalty of death. Jerusalem, as a Jewish city, was erased. It did not stay erased. In the 4th century, the Emperor Constantine converted to Christianity. Jerusalem was reborn as a Christian city. Constantine's mother, Helena, traveled to the Holy Land and reportedly identified the sites associated with the life and death of Jesus. Churches were built. Pilgrims arrived. The city that had been forbidden became a destination for the entire Christian world. By the 6th century, Jerusalem had more than 200 churches. Entire neighborhoods existed to house the pilgrims who arrived in an unending flow. In the year 614, the Persian Sassanid Empire invaded from the east. The city fell. Churches burned. Tens of thousands were killed or enslaved. The true cross, the relic believed to be the cross on which Jesus died, was carried away to Persia. It was a catastrophe from which the Christian community of Jerusalem took decades to recover. And then, 23 years later, came a different kind of arrival. In the year 637, the Arab Caliph Umar ibn al-Khattab entered Jerusalem on foot, wearing a simple robe, leading his horse. He had conquered a city that had been the center of the Christian world, and he arrived with no fanfare, no violence, no destruction. He negotiated the city's surrender personally with the Patriarch Sophronius, who had insisted on meeting the Caliph face to face before handing over the keys. Umar entered the church of the Holy Sepulchre with Sophronius. When the time for Muslim prayer came, Sophronius invited him to pray inside the church. Umar refused. If he prayed inside, he said, so his followers might later convert the church into a mosque. He stepped outside and prayed on the steps, and a mosque was built where he knelt, the Mosque of Umar, still standing today, directly across from the church's entrance, a monument to a moment of deliberate restraint. The city remained under Arab-Muslim governance for more than 4 centuries. Then came the Crusades, one of history's most dramatic, most complicated, and most devastating episodes. A series of military expeditions launched from Christian Europe, blessed by the Pope, animated by a potent mixture of genuine religious devotion, political ambition, economic opportunity, and apocalyptic expectation. In the year 1099, after 3 years of marching across thousands of kilometers, the First Crusader army reached the walls of Jerusalem. They had suffered enormously to get there. They had fought through Turkey, through Syria, through terrible heat and disease. They had been betrayed, abandoned by allies, reduced by starvation. When they finally saw Jerusalem from the hilltops to the north, veteran soldiers who had survived years of warfare fell to their knees and wept. They besieged the city for 5 weeks. When the walls were breached in the summer of that year, what followed was a massacre. Jewish, Muslim, and Eastern Christian inhabitants were killed. Historians' accounts differ in their estimates of the dead, but all agree the killing was extensive and indiscriminate. The Crusaders, convinced they were doing God's work, had arrived at the city of God with swords drawn and mercy abandoned. The city of peace became a slaughterhouse. They held Jerusalem for 88 years. They built, they fortified, but they made Jerusalem the capital of a Christian kingdom. They renovated the Church of the Holy Sepulchre into much of the form it holds today. They lived alongside Muslim and Jewish populations in an uneasy coexistence shaped by the constant reality of military occupation. And then, in the year 1187, Saladin arrived. Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, Saladin, was the Kurdish Muslim general who had united Egypt and Syria under the Ayyubid dynasty and spent years methodically dismantling the Crusader presence in the Levant. At the Battle of Hattin, fought in the hills above the Sea of Galilee in July of 1187, he lured the Crusader army into a waterless landscape in the midsummer heat and destroyed it in a single, catastrophic afternoon. The true cross, which the Crusaders had carried into battle as their most sacred battle standard, was captured. 3 months later, Jerusalem surrendered. What Saladin did next stopped Europe in its tracks. There would be no massacre. Every Christian in the city could leave safely, provided they paid a ransom, 10 dinars for a man, 5 for a woman, 1 for a child. Those who could not pay were freed anyway, on Saladin's personal order, much to the frustration of his own treasurer. An estimated 11,000 Christians were freed without payment. Saladin's brother paid the ransom for another 7,000 from his own pocket. Saladin's mercy was not weakness. It was not sentiment. It was a statement, a deliberate demonstration of what he believed Islam demanded of a just ruler in the moment of victory. He reopened Jerusalem to Jewish worship, which the Crusaders had forbidden since their arrival. He restored mosques to their function. He left the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Christian hands, appointing the Jude and Nusaybe families as its external keepers, an arrangement that persists, unchanged, to this day. 800 years after Saladin, a Muslim family still opens the most sacred church in Christendom each morning. His mercy left a monument that no army has ever been able to dislodge. In a city where conquest usually meant annihilation, restraint became its own form of power. The Crusaders returned, as they always returned. Jerusalem changed hands again and again. The Mamluks took it in the year 1259. The Black Death swept through in the 14th century, halving the population. Then, in the year 1517, the Ottoman Turks rode in from the north, and Jerusalem entered a new era. Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, who would govern the Ottoman Empire at its greatest extent, turned his attention to the Holy City in the 1540s. He rebuilt Jerusalem's walls, the walls that still stand today, that still define the old city, that visitors still walk along, that still gleam gold in the late afternoon light. Suleiman built 7 gates in those walls, each one designed with a different architectural sensibility, each one a statement of Ottoman power and piety. He restored the Dome of the Rock. He built fountains throughout the city. He made Jerusalem for a time a place of relative peace and reasonable governance. Empires fall, walls remain. Those walls stretch for 4 kilometers around the old city. They are punctuated by 7 open gates through which the living pass, and 1 sealed gate on the eastern wall facing the Mount of Olives. The Golden Gate, also called the Gate of Mercy. Through this gate, Jewish tradition holds the Messiah will enter Jerusalem at the end of days. Muslim tradition identifies it as the gate through which the just will pass on the day of judgment. The Ottomans, aware of the Jewish prophecy, sealed the Golden Gate with stone in the 16th century, and then, in front of it, they placed a cemetery, reasoning that no Jewish Messiah would pass through a graveyard to enter the city. The gate remains sealed, the cemetery remains, the prophecy persists, and pilgrims of all 3 faiths press their hands to those old stones and hope for different things, arriving at the same sealed gate from different directions and different centuries, united in nothing except the intensity of their longing. East of the old city, across the narrow Kidron Valley, a ravine that has served as a moat, a cemetery, a battlefield, and a borderline at various moments in its long history, a hill rises gently above Jerusalem, the Mount of Olives. It is not a dramatic peak. It is a gentle slope, broad-shouldered, its western face turned toward the old city as though watching. That western face is covered with tombs, the tens of thousands of Jewish graves arranged in dense rows that descend the hillside in a great cascading mass of white stone, following the natural contour of the terrain, pressing down toward the valley, all of them facing west, facing Jerusalem. This is the oldest continuously used Jewish cemetery in the world, active for more than 2,000 years, used by the Jewish community before the temple fell, used through every occupation and catastrophe and exile and return, used today, more new graves placed beside ancient ones, the living still choosing this hillside to wait in. Some of the rabbis and sages buried here are figures whose words are studied daily in Jewish communities on every continent. Their graves are worn smooth by the hands of those who come to pray there, to ask for intercession, to feel the thread connecting them to the tradition they have inherited. Jewish tradition holds that when the resurrection comes, it begins here, that the dead of the Mount of Olives will be the first to rise, because they are closest to the Temple Mount. Every tomb faces the same direction. Every body has been buried in perfect orientation for the same expected moment. The dead of the Mount of Olives are not merely resting, they are waiting. For Christians, the Mount of Olives marks a threshold, not a resting place but a departure point. From its summit, Jesus is believed to have looked out over Jerusalem and wept, saying, "If you, even you, had only known on this day what would bring you peace, but now it is hidden from your eyes." He foresaw the city's destruction and mourned it, even as it was happening, even before it happened. It was from the Mount of Olives that he made his final entry into Jerusalem on what Christians call Palm Sunday, riding a donkey, welcomed by crowds waving branches, a deliberately humble entry, fulfilling a prophecy from the book of Zechariah, written 500 years earlier. And it was from the summit of the Mount of Olives, 40 days after the resurrection, that Christian tradition holds he departed, ascending from this exact hillside, with the city spread below him in the morning light, until he passed beyond what human eyes could follow. The Chapel of the Ascension marks the spot. It is one of the smallest sacred spaces in all of Jerusalem. A simple octagonal structure, open to the sky at the center, built by the Crusaders over what they identified as the footprint left in the rock at the moment of the ascension. The Crusaders built it as a church. After Saladin's reconquest, it was converted to a mosque. Today, Christians hold a service there on Ascension Day, and Muslims pray there on Fridays. The same small space. 2 calendars. One sacred memory, understood through 2 different traditions, shared imperfectly, generously, across 8 centuries. For Muslims, the Mount of Olives carries eschatological weight of its own. It is identified in Islamic tradition as the place of the Last Judgment. On that day, a bridge, finer than a hair, or sharper than a sword, will span the valley of Kidron between the Mount of Olives and the Temple Mount. The righteous will cross it into paradise. Those who cannot will fall, and the judge will be God. Stand at the edge of this valley on a clear morning when the mist hasn't quite lifted and the golden dome catches the first horizontal light of dawn, and you will feel something that defies easy articulation, a weight, a stillness that is not emptiness but fullness, as if every prayer ever offered toward this hill has not dissipated but accumulated, layer upon layer, pressing into the air like warmth, pressing into stone. Perhaps that is what has kept bringing humans back here. Not just memory. Every city has memory. Not just beauty. There are more beautiful places on earth. But expectation. The sense, older than any of the 3 faiths that currently inhabit it, that this hill is where something is going to happen, that the story is not finished, that the last chapter has not yet been written. But Jerusalem is not only its sacred sites, its ancient stones, its layered theologies, it is also a market, a street corner, a cup of coffee in the morning, a child kicking a ball against an old wall, the smell of freshly baked ka'ak, the sesame bread rings sold by vendors in the Muslim quarter, their trays balanced on their heads, the rings stacked high as they push through the narrow streets, calling out their wares. The souk of the Muslim quarter is one of the most extraordinary sensory experiences on earth. Vaulted stone corridors built by the Crusaders, expanded by the Mamluks, perfected by the Ottomans. Overhead, the old stone arches, worn smooth by centuries of torch smoke and human breath. Underfoot, stone paved 1,000 years ago, polished to a low shine by 1,000,000 footsteps. On either side, stalls selling everything, spices in pyramidal mounds of color, turmeric yellow, paprika red, sumac purple, olive wood carvings, hand-painted ceramics, embroidered cloth, t-shirts, phone cases, plastic toys. The sacred and the commercial have always shared this city. The pilgrims who came to Jerusalem in ancient times also needed to eat, sleep, buy provisions, find accommodation. A city of pilgrims is, inevitably, a city of merchants. The souk has been there, in one form or another, for as long as there have been people walking these streets with needs and money and the desire to bring something home to those they left behind. In the Jewish quarter, the atmosphere is different, quieter, more residential, more recently rebuilt. Much of the Jewish quarter was destroyed in the fighting of 1948 and lay in ruins during the 19 years of Jordanian control. After Israel captured East Jerusalem in 1967, the reconstruction began. The streets are wide and clean by old city standards. Synagogues have been restored. Yeshuvas, academies of Jewish learning, fill the air with the sound of study. That distinctive back and forth of Talmudic argument, two voices debating a text that is 2,000 years old, finding in it something new today. The Armenian Quarter, tucked into the southwest corner, is a world apart. Quiet in a city that is rarely quiet, residential in a city that feels always in motion. And the stone walls of the Armenian Patriarchate enclose a small city within the city. A cathedral, schools, a seminary, a printing press, a museum dedicated to the Armenian genocide. The community that lives here is small, a few hundred families, but it has been here for 1,600 years, longer than the current walls that surround the old city, longer than most of the buildings visible from any rooftop in Jerusalem. They arrived as pilgrims in the 4th century, when Christianity was declared the faith of the Roman Empire. They stayed. They built. They survived the Arab conquest, the Crusades, the Mamluk period, the Ottoman centuries, the British Mandate, the establishment of Israel, the ongoing conflict. They have buried their dead in the same courtyard for 1,600 years. They maintain their own language, their own liturgical tradition, of their own sense of who they are, a community defined not by size or influence, but by an almost stubborn refusal to disappear. Their presence here is also a monument to survival of a different kind. The Armenian genocide of 1915, in which the Ottoman state organized the systematic killing of more than 1 million Armenians across Anatolia, now one of the first genocides of the modern era, sent survivors and refugees towards the few places in the world where Armenian community had already taken root. Jerusalem was one of them. The quarter swelled with survivors. The walls became a refuge. The community that had come as pilgrims in late antiquity became, in the 20th century, a sanctuary for the hunted. They do not seek attention. They do not raise their voices in the way of this city, which rarely stops raising its voice. But their quiet persistence is itself a kind of testimony, a low, steady note in the extraordinary symphony of this place that has never once, in 1,600 years, gone silent. In the 19th century, Jerusalem was a small, sleepy Ottoman town of perhaps 20,000 people, Jewish, Muslim, and Christian, living in roughly equal numbers within the old city walls. The surrounding hills were bare. The roads were poor. The city was a backwater by the standards of the Ottoman Empire, significant only for its religion, largely overlooked by the empire's administrative machinery. Then the world changed. Waves of Jewish immigration began arriving from Europe, first a trickle, then a flood, driven by the pogroms of Russia and Eastern Europe, the grinding poverty of Jewish communities across the continent, and a new political ideology called Zionism, which argued that the centuries of persecution suffered by Jews in Europe would only end when the Jewish people had a homeland of their own. And the homeland that Zionism imagined was the land of their ancestors, the land the Torah called Eretz Israel, the land that had, for 18 centuries, been called Palestine by those who lived there. Those who lived there Palestinian Arabs, Muslim and Christian, were themselves in the middle of building a national consciousness shaped by the decline of Ottoman power and the rising influence of Arab cultural and political awakening. They had been on this land for centuries. It was simply home. The First World War destroyed the Ottoman Empire and handed its remnants to the victorious European powers. Britain received a mandate over Palestine from the League of Nations and promptly found itself having made promises it could not simultaneously keep. Britain promised the land twice, to two different peoples, both promises written in ink, neither compatible. The resulting decades were marked by increasing violence, Jewish against British, Arab against Jewish, British against both, as the underlying contradiction became impossible to paper over. After the Second World War and the Holocaust, in which 6 million Jews were murdered by Nazi Germany in the most systematic act of genocide in history, the pressure to establish a Jewish state became overwhelming. The United Nations proposed a partition plan in 1947, dividing the land between a Jewish state and an Arab state, with Jerusalem under international administration as belonging to neither. The Jewish leadership accepted, the Arab states rejected, the British left, and on the 14th of May, 1948, Israel declared independence. The next day, 5 Arab armies invaded. The war that followed, which Israelis call the War of Independence, and Palestinians call the Nakba, the catastrophe, ended with Israel controlling most of the territory, Jordan controlling the West Bank and East Jerusalem, and approximately 700,000 Palestinians displaced from their homes, living in refugee camps across the region, waiting to return. They are still waiting. Jerusalem was divided. A concrete wall and a tangle of barbed wire cut through neighborhoods, separated families, divided the city along a green line drawn by armistice. The Old City, the Western Wall, the Temple Mount, all fell under Jordanian control. For 19 years, Jewish Israelis were denied access to their holiest sites. Jewish gravestones on the Mount of Olives were removed and used as building materials. Ancient synagogues in the Jewish quarter were demolished. But in June of 1967, in 6 days of fighting that shocked the world, Israel captured the West Bank, Gaza, the Sinai, and the Golan Heights. Israeli paratroopers fought their way through the streets of East Jerusalem. On the 7th of June, they reached the Western Wall. A military chaplain blew a shofar, the ram's horn used in Jewish worship, against the ancient stones. Soldiers wept. General Uzi Narkis, standing in the Old City, heard the words come through his radio that no Israeli had expected to hear in his lifetime. The Temple Mount is in our hands. 2,000 years of exile collapsed into a single sentence over a crackling radio. The photographs from that day, paratroopers at the Western Wall, young men in military gear pressing their faces to the ancient stone, weeping openly, became among the most iconic images of the 20th century. The moment felt, to millions of Jewish people around the world, like the completion of something begun in Babylon 2,500 years earlier. An exile that had finally ended, a return that had finally reached its deepest goal. But victory carried its own catastrophe. The Palestinian population of East Jerusalem found itself under Israeli governance they had not chosen and did not want. The question of Jerusalem's final status Who rules it? Who prays where? Who lives where? What flag flies over which building became the hardest question in one of the world's most intractable conflicts. Every peace negotiation of the past half-century has eventually run into this question and stopped. Israel has declared Jerusalem its eternal, undivided capital, recognized by a small number of countries. Palestinians have declared East Jerusalem the capital of the state they are still fighting to establish, recognized by a larger number. Most of the world's governments, threading the needle of diplomatic impossibility, have kept their embassies in Tel Aviv, refused to recognize either claim in full, and hoped that somehow, sometime, someone will find a formula that no one has yet found. Every peace plan eventually reaches Jerusalem and stops. And beneath these enormous declarations, beneath the geopolitical weight, beneath the theology and the history and the United Nations resolutions and the peace plans and the failures, real people. An Israeli family sitting down to Shabbat dinner in the Jewish quarter, the white tablecloth and the candles and the smell of challah bread, the same ritual performed in Jewish homes since before this city existed in its current form. A Palestinian family gathering in the Muslim quarter, the coffee brewing on a small stove, children doing homework at a table in a house that has been in the family for generations, a house that is now technically in disputed territory under international law and completely home to the people who live in it. A Christian family from the Philippines who have come on pilgrimage, touching the Via Dolorosa's worn stones with the kind of awe that no political complication can fully diminish. Jerusalem is not a symbol. It is a place where people live, and that is the most important fact about it, the fact that makes every abstract solution so difficult, the fact that keeps the question alive. Abstract problems can sometimes be solved by drawing lines on maps, but people's lives do not fit neatly on maps. Their memories do not. Their prayers do not. 30 kilometers east of Jerusalem, at the edge of the lowest point on earth, the cliffs of the Judean desert drop toward the Dead Sea. In the caves of those cliffs, in the year 1947, a young Bedouin shepherd named Muhammad Ed-Dib was searching for a lost goat. He threw a stone into a cave and heard the sound of pottery shattering. What he found inside changed the world's understanding of its oldest texts. The Dead Sea Scrolls, nearly 900 manuscripts, were discovered across 11 caves near the ancient settlement of Qumran between 1947 and 1956, are among the greatest archaeological finds in history. Written on parchment and papyrus, stored in cylindrical clay jars, preserved by 2,000 years of the driest air on Earth, they include the oldest surviving copies of nearly every book of the Hebrew Bible. The Great Isaiah Scroll, found in the first cave, that is 1,000 years older than any previously known Hebrew biblical manuscript, and virtually identical in content, a testament to the extraordinary care with which the Jewish tradition preserved its sacred texts across the centuries. The scrolls also include texts previously unknown, hymns, community rules, biblical commentaries, apocalyptic visions. They were written by a Jewish sect, almost certainly the Essenes, who withdrew from Jerusalem into the desert around the 2nd century before the Common Era, to live a life of strict communal purity while they waited for the end of days. They believed the temple in Jerusalem had been corrupted. They believed they were the true remnant of Israel. They bathed in ritual pools constantly. The Qumran site has more mikvaot, Jewish ritual baths, per capita than any other ancient site in Israel. They ate communally. They owned nothing individually, and they wrote or copied with obsessive, extraordinary care. The Essenes lived at Qumran for roughly 200 years. When the Romans came in the year 68 of the Common Era, 2 years before the destruction of Jerusalem, the community hid its library in the caves of the surrounding cliffs and fled. They never came back. The scrolls waited in the dark for 1900 years. What the Dead Sea Scrolls offer is a rare window into the spiritual world of exactly the period during which Jesus lived, taught, was crucified, and dénoué, according to Christian belief, rose from the dead. These were not just old texts. They were evidence that the faith of Jerusalem had survived intact through empires that did not. The world in which Christianity was born was a world in which communities like the Essenes were common, Jewish groups of every variety, debating, arguing, praying, or writing, waiting for God to intervene in history. The scrolls place the New Testament not in isolation, but in context, a context of extraordinary Jewish religious ferment, of multiple competing visions of what faithfulness meant, of apocalyptic expectation so intense it shaped every conversation. Jerusalem was the center of all of it, the city where all these visions collided, where the priests and the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the Essenes and the Zealots and the followers of the rabbi from Nazareth all brushed against each other in the narrow streets, all certain they understood what God required. South of Jerusalem, where the Judean desert drops toward the Dead Sea in a landscape of absolute, magnificent desolation, a flat-topped mountain rises from the desert floor on sheer cliffs on every side. Masada, from the Hebrew word for fortress. And a fortress is what it was, first built by the Hasmonean kings, then expanded by Herod the Great into one of the most sophisticated defensive complexes of the ancient world. Herod built Masada as a refuge, a place to retreat if his enemies, or his own people, ever turned against him. He built storehouses that could supply a population for years. He carved enormous cisterns into the rock, collecting the rare desert rains through an ingenious system of channels, enough water to outlast any siege. He built palaces on the northern cliff face, 3 tiers descending the rock in a breathtaking display of engineering audacity, with mosaic floors and frescoed walls and bathhouses heated by hypocaust systems. Roman luxury, suspended above the desert void. Herod never needed to use his refuge, but others did. In the year 66 of the Common Era, a group of Jewish rebels called the Sicarii seized Masada from its Roman garrison. When Jerusalem fell 4 years later, when the temple burned and the city was destroyed, survivors of the revolt made their way south to Masada. Nearly 1,000 men, women, and children, the last organized resistance to Roman rule in Judea, held the mountain against the most powerful army in the world. The Romans came. The 10th Legion, veteran troops, surrounded the mountain with 8 siege camps and a wall encircling the base. structures whose outlines are still perfectly visible from the summit today. Then they began to build. Across the western face of the mountain, along a natural spur, the Roman engineers and their Jewish slave laborers constructed a ramp of stone and earth, rising toward the summit. It took months. It was an extraordinary feat of military engineering, an army moving a mountain to reach a mountaintop. When the ramp was complete and the Roman battering ram breached the wall, the defenders of Masada made a decision that has been debated, mourned, and honored ever since. The leader of the Sicarii, a man named Eleazar ben Yair, delivered a speech, or so the historian Josephus records it, arguing that freedom was worth more than life, that they should not allow Rome to take them into slavery, that they should die by their own hands. The men killed their families. Then they drew lots to choose 10 men who would kill the rest. Then those 10 drew lots to choose one who would kill the remaining 9, and then himself. When the Romans breached the walls the next morning, but they found 960 bodies and silence. 2 women and 5 children had hidden and survived. They told the Romans what had happened. Rome would not take them alive. Rome would not take them at all. Masada became a symbol. In modern Israel, Masada shall not fall again became a phrase, a doctrine, a way of holding the memory of the last defenders against the longest odds. Israeli soldiers have taken oaths on the summit. The Israeli Defense Forces have held ceremonies on the mountain. It is a place of pilgrimage that carries, simultaneously, the weight of tragedy and the force of national resolve. Whether Masada inspires or warns, whether it is a model of heroic defiance or a cautionary tale about the refusal to compromise, is a question that Israeli society debates with the same intensity it brings to all of its hardest questions. There is a world in this land that exists between the sacred sites, between the political headlines, between the contested borders. A world of extraordinary natural beauty and biological richness that the weight of human history can sometimes cause us to overlook. The Judean desert, stretching between Jerusalem and the Dead Sea, is not the empty wasteland it appears from a distance. It is a living ecosystem of astonishing resilience. On the steep cliffs, or the Nubian ibex, a sure-footed mountain goat with sweeping, curved horns, navigates vertical rock faces as casually as a pedestrian on a sidewalk. The desert night belongs to the barn owl, whose specially asymmetric ears allow it to hunt by sound, alone in complete darkness, its wings designed for silence, its strike for precision. The Egyptian vulture, one of the few animals anywhere on Earth observed to use tools, picks up stones to break open eggs too large to crack with its beak. Or the caracal, a wild cat of extraordinary beauty, built like a compressed spring, can leap more than 3 meters into the air to catch birds in mid-flight. And over all of it, the peregrine falcon, the fastest animal on Earth, diving from altitude in a stoop that reaches speeds of more than 300 kilometers per hour. A living arrow, a blur of feather and intent, striking its prey with a precision that seems almost impossible given the speed at which it moves. The Dead Sea, 30 kilometers east of Jerusalem, at 430 meters below sea level, is the lowest point on the surface of the Earth. Its water is so saturated with salt and minerals that nothing can survive in it. No fish, no seaweed, no algae. The name is accurate, and yet the human body floats on it effortlessly, supported by the density of the brine, in an experience so strange and peaceful that people have been coming to its shores for therapeutic purposes since the time of Cleopatra. Its black mud is rich in minerals that ancient physicians prescribed for skin conditions, joint pain, and ailments whose names have long since changed. But the Dead Sea is disappearing. Since the 1960s, the Jordan River, its primary water source, has been diverted by Israel, Jordan, and Syria for agriculture and municipal use, to a degree that leaves almost nothing to reach the sea. The water level drops by more than a meter every year. Thousands of sinkholes have opened along the shoreline, swallowing roads and tourist facilities as the salt-saturated ground collapses where fresh water intrudes from below. What took millennia to fill is emptying within a human lifetime. The oldest natural spa on Earth is in danger of becoming the oldest natural memory. Come back to the beginning. Come back to the stone. It is before dawn in Jerusalem. The city is as quiet as it ever gets, which is not very quiet at all. A dog barks somewhere in the Armenian quarter. The wind moves through the alleys of the souk, rattling the closed metal shutters, carrying the smell of yesterday's spices and tomorrow's bread. From the minaret of a mosque in the Muslim quarter, the Fajr call to prayer rises in the darkness, long before the sun, a human voice, outreaching into the night, calling the faithful to be awake, to be present, to remember. In a few minutes, the Western Wall Plaza will begin to fill. Jewish men in long black coats will press their foreheads to the ancient stone, their breath visible in the cold air, their prayers the same prayers their fathers said, and their fathers before them, going back through centuries of exile and return, to a tradition so old it carries its own specific gravity. Bells will begin in the Christian quarter. First one, then another, irregular, answering each other across the narrow lanes. A Franciscan monk will light candles in the church of the Holy Sepulchre, where the oil lamps never fully go out. The Armenian priest will cross the courtyard of the Patriarchate, his black robes trailing across the same stone his predecessors have crossed for 1,600 years. Children will begin moving through streets that kings once walked, through streets that the Crusaders bled in, or through streets where the Ottomans traded and the Romans marched, and the Babylonians came with their armies, and the Persians and the Arabs and the British and the Israelis and the Palestinians and the pilgrims from every country on earth who have left their prayers folded in a wall and carried something home with them that they cannot quite name. What is Jerusalem? It is the city where Abraham was willing to give everything, and where God asked, and then did not take. Where Solomon built a house for the divine and discovered that no house can contain it. Where the prophets spoke truth to power and paid the price that truth-tellers pay. Where Jesus prayed among the olive trees and chose not to run, and carried a cross through a crowded market, and died on a hill outside the walls, and, if the faith that followed is true, came back. It is the city from which Muhammad ascended through the heavens on a night that changed the direction of prayer for more than 1 billion people. The city where Saladin showed the world what mercy looks like in the moment of victory. The city where the Crusaders showed the world what happens when faith becomes indistinguishable from violence. The city where a people returned from 2,000 years of exile and pressed their faces to a surviving fragment of wall and wept. It is the city that has been destroyed and rebuilt, forbidden and reclaimed, divided and unified and divided again. The city where the question of who we are, where we come from, what we owe each other, what is worth fighting for and what is worth surrendering, is asked every single day in every language spoken by human beings with an urgency that shows no sign of fading. It never has, and perhaps that is why it still burns in the human imagination. Jerusalem does not offer easy answers. It has never offered easy answers. What it offers is something rarer and, in the long run, more valuable. The weight of the question itself. The inescapable understanding that what has happened here, across 5,000 years of human longing, faith, violence, beauty, prayer, and grief, matters. That it is not finished. That the story being written on this hill is still being written. That every generation is added to the manuscript, whether it chooses to be or not. The light is changing now over the old city. The first pale gold touching the dome, spreading across the stone, warming it from the outside, while something warmer still persists from within. All those prayers, accumulated in the limestone like heat stored from 10,000 years of sun. The city of Jerusalem holds prayers the way stone holds warmth. Long after the day has ended, long after the light has gone, the city is waking. It never really slept. If this journey moved something in you, if Jerusalem's story stayed with you, the way these stones stay warm long after the sun has set, please like this video, subscribe to History Relived, and leave us a comment below. Every word you write is a reminder of why we make these documentaries. Thank you for walking with us through this extraordinary, heartbreaking, luminous city. We will see you on the next journey.